Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to this week's Inspiring Leadership podcast. I have Dr. Stephen Barden, and he and I have had some great conversations. What an interesting life he's led, from early days in South Africa to a number of senior leadership positions, and now making use of all that years of experience to coach and mentor other people. Now, I don't normally have fellow coaches and mentors on. I like to have the CEOs themselves, but since he's done both, it makes it well worth having him on. So without further ado, welcome, Stephen. Good to have you on the Inspiring Leadership podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you for asking me.
Yeah, no, it's a real pleasure. And just give us a little nutshell of those, when, now, and how, then, now, and how, sort of how you began then, what you're doing now, and how you made that journey from one to the other, and the lessons you learned on the way. It's always a great little then, now, and how story.
So starting from, as you hinted at, I mean, I was born and brought up into my early teenage years in the colonies, what was then the colonies, and in Tanganyika, which became Tanzania. My parents then sent me to South Africa, much to my horror, but that's another story. I was then I then went into radio and was a journalist and a writer and a producer and a presenter in radio and television in South Africa. We then got involved with the anti-apartheid movement, which resulted in my being put into detention by the security police. Then hurled out of South Africa with my then wife and my 1-year-old child and a Nagra reel-to-reel tape recorder. Arrived in Britain and thought, I got to do something. I've got to actually support these my wife and child, and found myself with. I had a very lucky one contact. I only had one contact in Britain, really, a real contact, and he was. Michael Bucht was his real name, and he was known as the Crafty Cook. I don't know if you're old enough to remember those. You must remember the Crafty Cook. He was wonderful because he was one of the designers of Capital Radio, one of the and also Classic FM. And he unfortunately died a few years back. But he said, I'd met him in South Africa. He said, come and stay with me when you come out. So we went and stayed with him. And he introduced me to one person on LBC. And within 4 days, I was doing freelance shifts, and I was always doing two shifts every day sort of thing to try and make up the money. And because, it was almost in a panic. I could have gone on and carried on being in exiled politics, if you like, which I just wasn't going to work for me. Or I was going to be driven by, quite frankly, fear of poverty, and that drove me. So I then went into LBC. I then left them after that and went full-time, appointed to a then breakfast television show called TVAM. Started off as a reporter, went into news editing, then became managing editor there. Then went on to Sky, where I was general manager, then became chief executive of a company called News Digital Systems, which was News International's technology division, which was partly based in Britain, partly based in Israel, and carried on, if you like. From then, did my stint as an entrepreneur. Mm-hmm. In technology, started a couple of technology companies, and then went to Germany, where I was hired in there as to head up the television and streaming divisions of Axel Springer, which is certainly was then a very big publishing company. Came back to Britain because I was headhunted into a company run by or owned by Guy Hands. And that was where my managerial career, if you like, ended, because I was then fired from there. And we can talk about that happily. And then went to, and I thought, that was the time, if you like. I thought, so Barton, what are you actually going to do now? You're either going to go into a panic and think, I've got to go and get another job, and I get another job, or just think about it. Just stop and think. And my first thought was, what was it that made, why was I fired? Okay, I could answer that. Why did they use bullying as a reason for firing me? So let me think about my own assumptions, my own moral codes, my own. So I sat and wrote for a year. I literally wrote, sat down and wrote. And I thought, and basically the central theme was, what are your assumptions? What have you been assuming about the world? What are your values? How many of those values do you really believe in? And how many have you actually inherited as fossils, if you like, from your parents, from your society? What has become blurred as you've been working for various people? And what do you really believe in? So what are you left with? And that's where I discovered that, and as much as I could. And then I thought, now do you want to go back into managing, or what do you want to do? So I thought, no, I want to go and I'm fascinated by the workplace. I've always been fascinated by the workplace. The workplace has been the core of my life, if you like. So I thought, no, what you need to do is need to go and work with people in a workplace, not necessarily, not as a consultant, although a coach takes all those things. By the way, just as an aside, I think coach is a word we probably need to move out of soon, because I think it's become too all things to all people. So I went and trained as a coach mentor in Oxford, and did the full, if you like. Now there was a learning process for you, Jonathan, because I had been a CEO, and I had a fair amount of power, both as a CEO and for Murdoch and the CEO, in fact, all the CEO jobs I had. And now I could either, for a few years, I kept on saying, I'm an ex-CEO, I'm a former CEO, when I was a CEO, until a kid of 26 years old said to me, Stephen, I think he was business development leader at one of the coaching agencies. He said, Stephen, I think you should stop calling yourself a CEO. I said, why? He said, because you'll never be a coach if you carry on calling yourself a CEO. And he was right. Mm-hmm. He was right.
Yeah, and let me just come in at that stage, because I think there's so much I'd like to unpack from what you said. Firstly, I think for us to move on, all the time, someone wiser than me once said, you have to let go of an awful lot of things before you can move. You have to unlearn some things before you can learn some other things. And I think it's a particular problem for many men who are attached to an identity. Women are better generally when they look at the research than men, because they're a mother, a wife, and various other things, if they are daughter, and then various roles that they have at work and things like that. But men, we get very caught up on, do you know who I am? I am or I was or I'm a has-been. Someone criticized, someone for being a has-been. It's better to have been a has-been than a might have been. And I thought that was a lovely comment. But let me just unpack, I think, some of the really interesting things. The first one was the fear of poverty, the fear, the accusations of bullying, the culture when you're with people like Guy Hans, Rupert Murdoch, and indeed others in quite driven organizations, media, journalism, the like. There becomes a certain culture that's accepted as the norm, but it is based on fear of failure and anxiety, and it's certainly not psychologically safe. And I'm sure you've written about that and you advise people about that. What was your thoughts? Because I think of moments when I was working for the head of the army, and I was scared of being fired like my two predecessors, and so fear was what in some ways constrained me, right? It didn't inspire me, it constrained me, but I was just working hard not to get fired. But it's not a nice way to live, is it?
No, you can't have an organization where you work hard not to get fired. And I think, funny enough, when I was at Sky, and I wasn't working directly for Murdoch then, I reported to him later on, but when I was at Sky, of course, it was at the time when Sky had just merged with the BSB, with the British Satellite Broadcasting. And it was, and a man called Sam Chisholm went in and basically cracked the two organizations together. Now, there was at the beginning something which was a fear, there was a fear environment. But here's the interesting thing. I don't, in my experience and from what I was observing as well of people there, the people who respond to that fear environment are people who have the ingredient in it originally. And my fear came from the fact that, I come from immigrant, if you like. My parents were expatriates from Cyprus, right? They were British subjects, but they had been in Cyprus. And then they were sent out by the British government. They were, as settlers in the days of the colonies. Now, the one thing that governs migrants or immigrants or emigrants is the drive to succeed, because you're not part of the society. You're half in and half out. And in order to become part of the society, what's being drummed into you, of course, is that you need to succeed. And I think that I inherited that, and it's not a genetic thing. It is the old principle that what people can't tell you, they make you feel. And I think my parents certainly drove that into me as immigrants, and I was, the first generation from them. And I think, therefore, my drive was, if I don't succeed, I will have failed not only myself, but the people behind me. You'll hear it. That is why migrants and immigrants are so driven by success. That's why you've got such a high rate of success, particularly in the professional classes, of immigrants in Britain and in the US and everywhere. In fact, I think everywhere, frankly. And I think that, just as an aside, I think it's such a waste where we don't use the skills and talents of migrants, of immigrants, of refugees when they come in.
And staying with that thought, when I think of a variety of different, very powerful, very successful CEOs that I am coaching at the moment, I can think of about 50% of them who are the children of migrants, or they moved themselves from India, let's say, to Germany or to America. And they are incredibly driven and very bright, probably, the smartest man in the room, but that's not always a great thing, because if you're the smartest man in the room, are you in the wrong room, is a fair challenge, but they are very driven. And I think with that comes, as you may look back on your own life, you've achieved an awful lot, you did a lot very early, but with that comes, there's a cost to it. And this workaholism and that drive to succeed, and I think of it myself, mother bringing 3 boys up on her own, husband killed. She thought she was going to be Lady Perks because her husband was, one of the top pilots of his generation, and they thought he was going to be an admiral. And then suddenly he was killed at 33. And so her whole aspiration then was through her children. So brother becomes president of plastic surgeons, and I go on, and she thinks I'm going to become a general. Well, I never did. But you have that, as you say, subtle message and the expectation of your parents that you will vicariously live their life that they never had, go to Oxford and do a coaching course and things like that, or become a CEO. And it really doesn't, you get in the grip of it. It doesn't really let up on you. You're always, even when they're dead, you're still trying to prove. I mean, I remember running in the Cyprus Double Mountain Marathon, for which I am proud to hold a world record. But when I was at the end of the first of 2 days, my team colleagues, the three of us, they were lagging. And I said, I had this image of my father there. And, he was going, come on, boy, you ought to get going. You're walking. And if you walk, you won't win. You'll become second or third. No one's heard of who's second or third, but they always hear of who wins. So get up and run. So I was grabbing them by the front of the shirts and saying, we're going to effing run. And they, okay, we'll run. But that kind of, it's a great drive, but there's a darker side, isn't there? The old dark triad. There's a darker side to the leaders that you've worked for and for your own leadership style. I mean, you've worked with Guy Hands, who, it was very Marmite for some people. You've worked with Rupert Murdoch, who's very Marmite for some people. You've known General Rupert Smith, who was very inspiring, and we both have a lot of time for him. So you've seen both the good and the bad. If you were to pick 2 CEO type leaders that you know today who are still serving, that you think are inspiring leaders and you want to shout out for them because you've been so impressed by them, who would be the ones that you think do have the inspiring leadership qualities that this whole program is about?
I'm going to turn that slightly, I'm going to throw a slight googly there. I think as I've got older, apart from, let me just think about this one. I think as I've got older, I've been inspired more by people who we don't think of as CEO type leaders.
Yep.
And I'll give you a couple of examples of that. One is, I do a podcast on refugees, as telling the story of refugees. And one of the young people I interviewed was a young man called Janvier Hafasha, who came out of the Congo, and he witnessed his father being slaughtered in front of him, and his mother being both raped and then killed in front of him, and his sisters were split from him, and he's never seen them again. He then made his way after a few years to a refugee camp in Uganda. And what did he do? I mean, he basically had to go and do trauma therapy in Cape Town later, but what did he do in the meantime? He set up an institution within the camp, a school in which he supported and works with sort of 115 children, in which he makes sure that they get the support that they need from each other. He makes sure that they get enough food. He makes sure that they are taught about how to look after themselves. He went out and he started a little farm there. So he went out, despite this huge trauma he went through, and it really was, he had to go through, all that trauma therapy, but he did that before. And off he went and he led these people. Now that, I have to tell you, just inspires me hugely. Just, I find it, and I'm not saying that in any sort of soft way. This is, you know my background, you know where I come from, and so this is a real pragmatic admiration that inspires me hugely. Similarly, I interviewed quite recently a young woman who's half Ukrainian and half Palestinian. So left the camp in the Lebanon, where the Palestinian camp in the Lebanon, where her grandfather had been, where her father was born, where she was born, and then went to the Ukraine for safe haven, and of course got caught up in the war there, which we both chuckled about in a black humor sort of way. But again, how does she come out of this? Not with rage and anger, but wanting to do good, wanting to be a peacemaker, and that really inspires me. That's the leadership.
I would happily embrace what you're saying, that the reason I ask about CEOs is that in the limited time I have left alive on the planet, I want to see as much inspiring leadership around the world. Now, I do find individuals like Harry Buddha Magar, who was a corporal in the Royal Gurkha Rifles, blown up by an IED in Afghanistan, lost both his legs above the knee, but now has climbed Everest with little crampon claws on the end of his stumps of his feet. I mean, that is just phenomenally resilient, and the determination to climb various peaks, not just one. And then when I was doing the Ride for Unity in the UAE with a mixture of people from Israel, Lebanon, Egypt, Iran, America, Britain, 20 of us, there was such harmony in that group. And what we achieved in the orphanages and the schools, and with refugees from the Lebanon and Palestine, and giving them sports equipment and things like this, and the people that we met who were suffering from terrible mental and physical disability, touching the lives of those with this eclectic mix of people. All of the 20 people I met, I was there with my wife, all inspired us, and many of them we're going to do podcasts with them, and they're not CEOs. So take Justin Levine. Justin, at 21, coughed, had a hernia, something went wrong in his spine, an operation went wrong, he got paralyzed, and so he's now wheelchair bound. But the way he threw himself around in and out of wheelchairs, in and out of the minibuses, and then got on his hand bike, so he pedals with his hands, and he's done 3,000 miles across America and raised £200,000 for a children's charity. Those are not CEOs. They're just people who've give great inspiration to us. But the reason I pick on the CEOs, in the limited time, I want to influence the maximum number of people. So if we can help the leaders of organizations be more inspirational, have more integrity, treat people better, live by the values they espouse, then it has the greatest impact in the shortest possible time with the limited time on this planet. So I'm completely with you. Sadly, you find that some of the leadership positions, you do get the white collar psychopaths get those kind of roles. They're driven. I mean, your story about relative power and learning power as a child, I think, is so relevant in your book. And for those listening, the book is just coming out. I think it's how successful leaders do business in their world.
It's been out for some time, but
a reprint in paperback, I think, is it?
But the paperback's coming out on the 29th of January.
Tell us a bit about that book. I think it's interesting. Why did you write it?
Yeah, that book was basically part of. I'd always been curious, because of my own experience, and when I was, I'd always been curious how leaders experience their learning. I mean, how did they? What assumptions did they have when they went into their business? Into leadership, and how they took in, if you like, what filters they took in, through what filters did they take in their learning when they were leaders. So that inspired me to do a doctorate back in, I think I started it in 2011 or something. And I thought, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to take top leaders, and those were leaders defined as having enough authority and influence to change things. So there had to be, so I thought, what I'll do is I'll take top academics, who are university presidents or heads of school federation, but top academics, some global CEOs. And at that stage, I wanted politicians, and I wanted cabinet level politicians. So I had contacts in each of these things. So I wrote to all these people in these categories. And I said, look, this is what I want to do. You remain anonymous because I want you to be anonymous, because I don't want you to be to feel vulnerable, because if you feel vulnerable, what you're going to do is you're going to start ordering your own defense, if you like, you're going to make some sense of your life. I think it was a writer called Isaacs who talked about we create sort of coherence out of our incoherent lives. So I said, you're going to be anonymous. I will sign anything. You will not be revealed. I wanted to be able to interview you. This is how we're going to do it. This is the methodology. Academics, I got some really, really good academics, and they, both in Europe and in the UK and in the US, and they said, absolutely, we'll do that with you. And then I got some CEOs, and one turned me down, but then referred me immediately to a colleague of his. So there it was people based in China, people based in Europe, people based in the USA. Now here's the interesting one. And all of them, by the way, I didn't come in out of the cold. I gave them contacts, referrals. If I didn't know them personally, I gave them referrals. People that they knew and trusted. The politicians did not respond at all. Jonathan, nothing. We didn't get cold shoulder. We got no shoulder. We got nothing. Fortunately, my supervisor had a former colonel as one of his former students, and said, why don't you contact this guy and see if the military will do something? And I got access to the most extraordinary people in the military at general level, at 2- and 3-star general levels and more. And I then interviewed them and with this first thing of saying, okay, what do I want to do? This is what, tell me how you absorbed your learning as you were in the top job. They, in fact, had different ideas, all of them, because they started saying things like, when I was a child, I used to do this. When I was a child, my mother used to say I could cure cancer at 4. When I was a child, and I thought these guys wanted to talk about children when they were children. Mm-hmm. And out of that came these massively rich interviews that ranged anything from 3 to 7 hours each. And I had 2 or 3 of these, and then wrote it up, in terms of the particular methodology. And from that, the model emerged, and I kept on going back to them, by the way, verifying what they'd said. Did you say this? And the model came out that basically, and that was the foundation, that was the thesis that said that the way leaders manage their worlds, the way they exercise their authority and power, comes from the assumptions they built up as children about the power relationship, the relative power relationship they had with their worlds, their early worlds, which was siblings, parents, etc., etc., etc. And it then went on to say that the most successful, because we looked then at the most successful leaders, and the research continues, post in my own practice, the most successful leaders are the ones who understand and have created a basic foundational assumption that they and their world are in reasonable equilibrium, that the world is not out there to get you, that the world does what it does and you don't, but you are partners. You're in what I call a partnering stance.
Yeah, and just picking up on that one, because I'd love you to say more in a moment, but it is very interesting to me, that idea of equilibrium, and also what's happened in our childhood. And you and I discussed before this, the Hoffman process, that I interviewed the managing director of the Hoffman Institute about this idea that our childhood, the deficit of love, or maybe even power, or the surfeit of it, that has an impact on our behaviors today. And that we have to go back and visit what happened. And you can't just move on and just ignore it all and just go, it's nothing, because it still will bite you. It will still, the tentacles from childhood stretch all the way through your life. You in your 70s, me in my 60s, still hugely influenced by that. But when we can face them, confront them, remove the mask that we put on to survive in that environment, because that's the only way to get through, then we can become much more authentic, have real conversations, be appropriately vulnerable. Because I think a lot of the time there's a lot of scared people hiding, a bit like the Wizard of Oz, hiding behind a big front, that they've got this little voice booming out from behind it. But behind it is someone who doesn't want people to know about what they're really, really like. And therefore they polish up and shape, and as you say, make coherence from their incoherent lives. I think that's a very good way of looking at it. And try and justify everything and explain it away rather than face some of the things that they didn't do. And just one final thought, and then back to you with the book, is that I am really taken by Stoic philosophy. It's been a great help to me and to a number of the leaders I've worked with. This idea that you can't control what happens to you in life, but you can control how you respond to what happens to you. The controlling the controllables, and really that's only your thoughts and your actions you can control, only up to a point, and even those. But you can't control other people. People try, and that's where they break themselves, because they try and control everything around them. And when things don't work out as they want, or like you described, you get fired or something like that, it causes a bit of a moment of crisis. And I know, when I got an average report, having always been outstanding in the army, that was my seminal moment when I went back to look at my father and his upbringing and his life and the way he was an inspiring leader. What could I learn from him? Because I'm clearly not a good enough leader. I need to be a better leader to succeed. Back to this theme you talk about, this drive to succeed that pushes us on up that mountain when everybody else wants to walk. What's your thoughts?
I think, yeah, I think what Hoffman's doing, of course, is he's using the filter of attachment, love, whatever you want to call it, and I use the filter of power. In other words, and power I define as simply the ability to do, the ability to act. I think, and I think, we need to almost go through a process, whichever filter you want to look at. I think I remember seeing at one stage something that you had said on a stage where you said, there are two most important
days in your life.
Two important things in one's life: being born and then
the day you found out why. Yeah, Mark Twain. Yeah.
And mine is slightly different. Yes, of course, most important is when you were born, because at least you've got a basis to continue from then on. The other one is, finding out what you were born into. What is your role in that world? What you were born into, because then you start thinking,
or who you were born into.
It's actually the context for me. It's the context and the text. There's a huge dynamic between text and context, and we can talk about that in terms of leadership as well. That's why I get hesitant about talking about inspiring leaders, because it is very contextual for me. But in terms of I needed to find, and what you were saying, I think, is very similar, to find not only who we are. We can't talk about who we are without saying in what context are we? There is no such thing as self-awareness in my mind. There is self-awareness in the world. I am aware of myself in relationship to the world, because otherwise you're aware of yourself what? In a vacuum? No, forget it. You're aware of yourself in relationship to the world. And therefore we need to know what are the dynamics within that world, and what role we play and what role we want to play in that world that makes it important. And then you start examining, okay, so in that case, what has been constraining me so far, what has been driving me, and starting to come to terms with that, understanding what you're doing with that. And for me, the big hope is, since those things are not hereditary, they are learnt, they are socialized. Things that are learnt can be unlearnt and relearnt.
Yes. Yeah. So this is fascinating. Both the book you've written, the research, the revelations you had, particularly around surprise, surprise. I found the same, that politicians didn't want to play, and indeed, they almost get there by mistake or by ambition. But with the military, they're trained. I mean, I think I looked back at my own training over 20 years, probably £250,000 of development the army spent. on me. And politicians, are they ever developed? Are they ever sent on any courses to be better leaders? No, none of them ever. Not a penny is spent on them. They don't even get coaching. And so here we have the likes of, the Trumps, the Liz Truss, the Borises. And you go like, they're just disastrous. But the consequence of their inadequacies is massive for the whole scope of the world. And we've now got a world full of populism, post-truth, and polarization. And populism's a big thing. And look at what's happening. So goodness, heaven help us. But let's bring it back from the bigger picture. I want to take it into your story and your experience, and particularly with all that wisdom that you've accumulated through your successes, your failures, being fired, whatever it might be, but doing some interesting jobs like general manager at Sky. Let's just go through, because we've got about 15 or so minutes left. I want to sort of quick fire, just take it through with some tips that you can share with those listening around the world. First one, your darkest moment and what it taught you, for you personally, a dark moment in your life and what you learned from it.
Well, I suppose the dark moment was, was the firing in one sense. Another dark moment was when I was thrown out of South Africa.
And what did you learn from both?
What I learned, I think, from both is, in fact, when I was thrown out of South Africa, I could have stopped and thought, but didn't, and remained, as I said, driven by that urgency, that fear to come back again.
Yeah.
What I learned certainly when I was fired was stop, don't panic, think, because now you need to look at this engine that you are, this being that you are. You need to look back and retune the engine. And it is not a case of, so I stopped. What I learned to do was not to panic. Was that permanent? No, there have been times since then when I've panicked, when I haven't had, say, enough clients, or I haven't done the marketing, so therefore I need to go back in and do the. But it taught me that don't panic. And I think the other thing that it taught me is that things pass.
Yeah.
Things change.
Isn't it that famous one from the slave who rode behind the emperor? And
yes,
he's not only does he say memento mori, but I think to King Solomon he said, "This too shall pass," and I think that's really helpful to us. On to just having a whiz around the Inspiring Leadership Compass with a few of the areas. MQ is one that seems to come out very strongly for people, that your values, your beliefs, what drives you. And you did allude to when you were fired, there was a comment about bullying. Was that you being bullied, or was that?
No. I was accused of being bullied.
Yeah. Okay. Now there must have been some smoke and some fire. So what was your learning from a moral integrity point of view and the way you treating people that they perceived you to be bullying them? What do you now, looking back on with time?
Whether they did or whatever, but yes, you're right. Here's the proper question. Here's the answer to that one. Before I went into that particular job, the job I was doing then when I was fired was basically a white goods company that we were converting into a technology-driven company. That's why I was brought in. The jobs that I had done beforehand were in the media. We're in television. We're in the media. Now in television, certainly in those days, don't know what it's like now, but certainly in those days, very hierarchical. When your editor said, or your managing editor said, could you, in a polite way, could you jump, please, or just jump, you jumped. It was very, very hierarchical. It was that old newspaper thing, which was, which went into the television. You do that. Now, you do that in a white goods company that is now being turned upside down and being turned into a technology company, and you're doing that jump. It's very good for speed and it's very good for efficiency. It is not good for the culture. They don't see that.
Yeah.
So what did I learn from that? What I said earlier on, leadership is terribly, terribly contextual. You may be a good leader in television, but you turn out, you go and become a leader in a technology company or a retail company, you turn out to be a very bad leader.
Yes.
What do we do when we're in nowadays? We say, okay, so that particular person was lovely in that bank. We'll move him over into that bank. Different culture, different context. And you think, why did he not work out? He didn't work out because of a different context.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really great tip. And so for those listening, I think what I'm taking away from your experience was have the humility when you move into a new one to go, this is completely different. And I need to almost unlearn all the things I've learned. What is appropriate for this environment and what will make others feel seen, heard, recognized, motivated, and willingly give their discretionary life energy to me as the leader. Love that. Second one around purpose. You're often coaching and mentoring people who perhaps not really found their sense of meaning and purpose. How do you help them get a real grip on why they're here on the planet? What are they in service of? What do you do to help?
Well, what I do is I use the model that I've written about, which is the book and the thesis before that. But I use that to actually find out where the world in which they are an integral part, if you like, and therefore from there say, okay, so what are your values? What is important to you? What do you need to do? What is what drives you? What gives you that passion and that love? Because I think one of the things we tend to do is to say what drives you rather than what brings you joy. And if it brings you joy, sure as nuts, it's going to be something that is of moral value to you and of moral value to the world.
Yeah, no, I love that.
I don't subscribe to the idea that, somebody, unless they are completely pathologically psychopath, mad, they don't, if you do something that brings you joy and brings you, and you do it with the people that bring you joy, and there is a moral, there is a moral reward out of that, I think.
Yeah, I think it's right. And the next one that I'm interested in is health quotient, mental, physical health, well-being. Now, you grew up and worked very hard in places like Sky and TV, managing editor, digital systems, Axel Springer, Guy Hans, Rupert Murdoch. That, as a naive onlooker, doesn't sound like an environment where health, well-being, working in the gym, eating good food is praised and encouraged. Am I completely wrong, or was that the case?
I think in certain cases you are wrong. I certainly, when I was working at TVAM, I was sent to Harvard to do one of these 3-month executive courses, whatever it was. Mm-hmm. And I learned there that in order to survive, just physically, because clearly I had to, you were crammed in doing more stuff than you could possibly fit into a day. Plus, of course, there was the job back in London, if you like. I learned then to go to the gym. I learned then to go to the gym 3-4 times a week. And then what I learned after that, and what I try always to make sure with my own clients, individual clients, is that they maintain a balance. And I don't subscribe to work-life balance. It's life balance. You balance your life. It's not as if your work is separate from your life. You're all the same, but you need to balance what you're doing. You need to do some. So, I always will encourage people to meditate, because it a number of reasons, both mental and physical and focus wise, and so meditation is important. I think that going to the gym or going running or something physical exercise is good. And actually, I've learned as well in the last 5 or 6 years that the body, particularly as you get older, guys, it's all coming to you. It's all coming to you too. Is stretching. And I learned, and I do Pilates. I do Pilates very regularly, and one of my favorite authors, Haruki Murakami, spends hours just stretching the body, just to make sure that the body is flexible and fluid. So what you're doing, you're creating, of course, if your body is fluid, your mind is going to be fluid, because your mind is not just up, it's not up just up here, it's throughout the body. And if you create some sort of balance where you're saying to your body and your mind, I'm not sending you down this particular rabbit hole. I'm giving you as much perspective as I can. I'm giving you as much variety as I can. I think you're starting to create healthy leaders.
No, I like that. I like that. Now, there's a number of the others. I could talk about emotional intelligence and your tips about people listening and reading others better, because many of your clients and mine haven't quite developed that well. We could talk about diversity, getting with people different, resilience, brand, legacy. I don't want to cover all of them, but if you were to pick one that you'd like to speak about that resonates to you with a tip to those listening around the world, which one would you pick of those?
I think, let's talk about, I think you talk about relationships.
Yeah.
And this goes back to my core theme about, the balance of understanding that you need to have a balance of relationships. You need to be able to see relationships as a partnering thing, as a partnering stance. And people will ask, how do you do active listening, or how do you show people you listen? Be curious. Be curious. If you're not interested in other people, then at least find something to be interested in a particular person. I've worked with, I'm fairly left-wing, I reckon, if one can call it left-wing nowadays. But I've worked with, some of the people I worked with have been very right-wing, as people would have gathered. Why was I able to do that? Why was I able to work with people who are of different political opinions? It's because I was curious. I wanted to know what was going on with these people. And I also think that human beings are more than their political beliefs if they will just come out from under their shells and from under their protections. So curiosity drives relationships. I think relationships drive successful leadership. You cannot do things on your own. And if you do try and do things on your own, you do shrink your organization, your constituency, your country to the size of your head. And I think, I think the Trumps and the Trusses and the people we were talking about and the Johnson people do that. They shrink their countries to the size of their heads and the size of their fears.
Yeah, no, I mean, so true. I do love that just the simplicity and the power of curiosity. And I come across people who really are clearly, I mean, either I'm very boring and everybody else was very interesting to them before they met me, but you just know they're not at all interested in you. Or you're at some cocktail party. If I think back to some of the ghastly events I was at in the military, many of them were quite fun, but some of them where you see someone looking over your shoulder for someone who's more important to their career, will help their promotion, but you're not the one. And you just know they go, and they're not even listening, or they just look right through you as if you are a window, and you go, you really are utterly ignorant, and I'm very boring. I accept that, but this is not a conversation I want to have. And it's almost like quite early on when you're with people and you can't find a connection, even try as you might to be interested in them. I found these days I'm frank enough to go, I don't think this is going to work. This is like, let's not play. This is a game. You and I know this is not working. Let's just say, we met, okay, didn't work. But I think then counter that, my old boss who said there's no such thing as a clash of personalities. You're going to have to find a way to get on with people in life who are very different from you. Which takes me on to the last three questions, which is really, people are very different. When you're in teams, and you've led many different teams, and you're coaching teams, you're coaching leaders who are leading teams, what's your wisdom and advice when people listening have got a toxic person in their team, the team's gone bad, or just generally the team's drifting and it really isn't humming, the trust's gone, whatever it is? What have you seen if people are short of time? What actions could they take?
I think one is make sure that you've defined what the purpose is of the team. And really a pragmatic purpose. What is the pragmatic purpose of this team? No, don't go wishy-washy on this one. What is the actual pragmatic purpose of this team? And does everybody understand that? And does everybody share that? Number one. Mm-hmm. And now we're talking in this hypothetical case, we're talking about a toxicity either in one individual or in particular individuals. Now, you may find that if there has been a blurring of purpose, that the toxicity comes because they can't see the purpose and therefore they're promoting their own vested interests, and that's where the toxicity comes. However, there may also be a case of that the competitiveness within the team has got so great, and I've seen a number of organizations like this, that becomes more important than what the purpose is on the outside. Then you have to say, okay, what I do then is to get them to share their values. If the purpose is absolutely clear, then take a look at and say, start looking at what are your values? What are your values and what do you share with each other in terms of their values? What is important to you? And by the way, values, let's not get, again, too soft on that one. Values to me is what is important to you, what holds more weight than another. Yeah. So you start to share those values, and I found an extraordinary one. I remember doing a board in Frankfurt some time ago where they were really toxic. And then I got them to share their values, just to talk to values. And it was extraordinary how much, once they'd found that they had these common values, they were able to then move forward.
It did unblock it.
It was extraordinary. Yeah, it was really extraordinary because, particularly between two individuals who really hated each other. And I said, tell me what's important to you, to the one, tell me what's important to you. And then we shared and we said, what does it mean to you? And they suddenly started realizing they were driving for very much the same thing. What they were disliking about each other was they didn't trust one another because of the competitiveness that went on.
Yeah. And trust and the competition. You hire people for their hunger to strive and achieve goals and increase sales and things like that. The problem is when they make it red energy against their peers in their first team, rather than green energy against the growth of the organization and competition outside it, they make it internal. That's very good. No, I like that one. Okay, last two questions. Favorite book? It doesn't have to be about leadership. It could be about any topic. But if there's a really cracking book that people would read and it would add something to their life, apart from your own excellent book, How Successful Leaders Do Business.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. Did you say apart from my own excellent?
Apart from your own successful book. Humor is very important. Humility, humanity, and humor. This humility thing, have you done that one, Stephen? Yeah, we worked on that one. It's hard to be humble when you're so effing big as Robbie Williams
totally.
sang.
I wouldn't. I wouldn't insist on my book. I've gone blank in terms of a managerial book. I might.
Just a great read. A great read.
But the book that here's the surprising one for me, because I was going back onto meditation. The book that I've gone back and back to, and it's not a managerial book, is called The Physicians of the Heart. Mm-hmm. And it's written by, amongst others, a man called Wali Ali Meir. And it is both a psychological and a philosophical analysis of the 99 names of Allah.
Oh, right.
and it is an extraordinary book. It is one that you can look at random, or you can go through, from page one to page. But it is a book I always return to. It is a very deep for me and very, very profound book, and I found it as a huge amount of help throughout the last 10, 15 years.
Fantastic. Well, I will go and get it and I will go read it.
Good.
Thank you very much indeed. So Stephen, we're now on the final top tip. So this stands in its own right as well as being part of this podcast. Would you just kindly say who you are, introduce yourself, what you're doing now, what you've done in the past, some of the jobs you've had, and what your practical 2-minute top leadership tip is?
Well, I'm Stephen Barden, and I'm not a might have been. I am a has been. I've been a broadcaster. I've been a CEO, and I am a coach and a writer and a podcaster. And my top tip, I think, is never try and do things on your own. You can as a leader, make a decision on your own, but don't bake it on your own. Always work with other people and know the difference between needing the advice of other people and actually going and seeking it. Needing it is a problem. Seeking it is what you need to do.
That's a great bit of advice. Thank you very much indeed, Stephen. Well, a real honor to have you on the Inspired Leadership podcast. I've thoroughly enjoyed it. I know we could have gone into so many different topics, but I really enjoyed it. And the intellectual stimulation that's come from this has been very good for me. And I hope it is for all those listening around the world. So thank you for being on the podcast.
Thank you, Jonathan. Thank you. It's been a joy. It's been an absolute joy. Thank you very much. And well done on your stuff. Really good.
Thank you very much.